This is now the second part of our discussion of Andrea Wulf's Humboldt biography, The Invention of Nature. I'm again joined by Cody Kommers, a fellow PhD student, podcaster, and reader of this book, I guess.
Awesome. Looking forward to talking about these sections, Ben.
Cool. Yeah, today, maybe that's we're discussing parts 3 and 4, and as always, I'll have a brief 2-3 sentence summary per chapter. Chapter 9. Humboldt returns to Europe and settles in Paris. He brings a huge collection of unknown species and enjoys his fame. He talks to Simón Bolívar about a potential revolution in South America without actually encouraging him to be the leader. Chapter 10. Humboldt moves to Berlin due to politics rather than preference. He writes several books, including Essay on the Geography of Plants, which was admired by Goethe, and Views of Nature, which was loved by many, including Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Charles Darwin, and Jules Verne. He goes to Paris on a political assignment for the King of Prussia, but decides to actually stay there. Chapter 11. Against his brother's wishes, Humboldt stays in Paris during the Napoleonic Wars. He enjoys great fame and respect, working all the time on his books, correspondence, experiments, and giving talks. He wants to leave Europe, though, for another expedition. Chapter 12. Simón Bolívar starts a revolution in South America to free South America from the Spanish colonists, inspired by Humboldt's writing and aided by Humboldt's maps of South America. Chapter 13. Humboldt stays in London to get permission from the East India Company to be allowed to explore India and climb the Himalaya. His request is denied, probably due to Humboldt's explicit and strong negative opinions on colonization. Chapter 14. Humboldt is given permission and finances the travel to India, only to have the permission taken away again. He is still widely admired, meets many famous and influential people, but is poor and forced to move back to Berlin. Chapter 15. Humboldt spends most of his time in Berlin entertaining the King Friedrich Wilhelm III. He also gives a very popular lecture series to the public. Almost 3 decades after his travels to South America, Humboldt receives an invitation from Tsar Nicholas I for an all-expenses-paid expedition through Russia. Chapter 16. Humboldt travels through Russia all the way to where the borders of Russia, China, and Mongolia meet. On the way, he celebrates his 60th birthday with Vladimir Lenin's grandfather and returns to Moscow and Berlin, the expedition having been a great success. Chapter 17. In 1831, inspired by Humboldt both for the journey itself and in his description of the journey, Darwin boards the Beagle for an around-the-world trip with lengthy stays in South America. Chapter 18. In his 70s, Humboldt publishes Cosmos. The first book spans the universe, Earth, and all living creatures, and the second book focuses on human history. The books were a total success among all parts of society, from scientists to the general population. And finally, Chapter 19, inspired by Humboldt's Cosmos, Henry David Thoreau becomes a serious writer and rewrites Walden to its current form. That was quite a lot of chapters.
No, we really covered the majority of Humboldt's life here. So
yeah, exactly.
where we finished off at the end of discussion 1 was he'd just come back from South America, very much a young man, very much this big, expedition that he undertook. And now this is just him living out his life as a consequence, essentially, of having undertaken this one initial big, magnificent adventure. And sort of bookended by his Russia adventure, which was his second big adventure, which was really 3 decades after his first big travel, and then his magnum opus, Cosmos. So we sort of see the whole, sort of middle part of his life in these sections.
I mean, it's basically years 30 to 70 something, right? Roughly that. Yeah.
So let's see. I think there's one thing that I want to, there's a kind of couple things that stood out to me about when he came back to Europe, particularly when he came back to Berlin. And that's one thing is that I partially want to kind of just like plant a seed of now we can come back to after we've talked about everything that he's went through. He went through, and his influence on Darwin and Henry David Thoreau and these other incredible people. And I think that part of what was so impactful about his trip was the one to South America, the big, sort of initial thing that put him on the map was in a word, magnitude. He simply went farther than anyone else had and collected more than anyone else had.
Yeah.
And I think what we're going to see as we talk about Darwin and a lot of this stuff is that it really provided, in a sense, raw data for people to work with, and to also provide a template for what people were going to do in the future. And I also think for us young academics and people who are, interested in this kind of world and everything, I think Humboldt is also a lesson, a very representative lesson in how a single good study conducted in one's 20s can sustain an entire career. Because this is what he did. He did one big exposition, and then he spent the next 30 years talking about it. And people fucking loved it.
Yeah, I found that crazy too. And the same, in some sense, applied, at least in the beginning, to Darwin also. They went on this trip, both financed by their parents, essentially. And then suddenly everyone wanted to talk to them about all their great findings. I mean, I guess, as we discussed last part, it's very difficult to do that stuff and all these kind of things, of course. But effectively, he spent 5 years going on an adventure, and suddenly he was a scientific superstar almost.
Absolutely.
Not only scientific, I mean, just general superstar, it seemed.
Yeah. It's not like he was constantly traveling for his entire life. No, he had one really big travel adventure. And on that basis, which admittedly, he what he was spending that 30 years doing was a lot of sifting through what he had found, both in terms of the physical specimens and the intellectual concepts and everything like that. So he was productive during that 5 years, but it's just so funny how it was just this one big thing that he was cashing in on for his entire career. And in many ways, I suspect that resembles a lot of academic trajectories, is that you have one really significant idea, usually, in your 20s, and then you kind of spend the next 20 so years rearranging adjacent ideas and elaborating on that and telling people what the core of that idea and that finding was. So
now I feel like I need to have, I'm already 30 and I haven't had this yet. Does that mean it's over?
I don't know if that means it's over, but maybe this is only one template. Maybe there's another template out there, which is that you actually spend years 30 through 70 doing novel science, and stuff. That would be an alternative besides the one and done approach. So maybe that's.
I was about to say that sounds like more work, but from the description of it, I found it really weird that in a way it seemed like he was working all the time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But then, it was conflicting in the sense that, at least for when he was in Berlin, he spent most of his days, it seemed, more or less entertaining the king. So he wasn't really doing any work in that sense, although he had to, I think he still had this huge drive to, work in the middle of the night to finish these things. But yeah, I found it weird how there was this at one point, on some points, this description of him working so much and constantly giving talks and all these things. And at other points, the description of him just meeting people, but basically him talking the entire time and never letting anyone else talk, which I guess also relates to our point about vanity from that you mentioned in the first part.
Absolutely. No, I think this is the other thing that stands out to me about his return to Europe, is that he just couldn't stand being there, particularly in Berlin. So I've got a couple quotes direct from Humboldt here, which he described himself initially in Berlin as, quote, isolated and as a stranger, to describe his sort of, feeling of being there. And then another choice line was, he felt, quote, buried in the ruins of an unhappy fatherland. Why did I not stay in the forest at the Orinoco or on the high ridges of the Andes? And then going on to say that, quote, court life robs even the most intellectual of their genius and freedom. And going to your point about him spending the majority of his time kind of being a scientific celebrity, entertaining people, engaging in evidently very magnificent disquisition for these people, but not necessarily doing the work of furthering his scientific ideas, though definitely getting them out there into the sort of popular consciousness, it seems like.
Yeah, but it sounds like his meetings with the king were the 19th century equivalent of committee meetings, in which he was basically just caught up for the large majority of his life.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I have one point about that just occurred to me that I found kind of interesting, is that, as you just mentioned, he talks about wanting to leave Europe multiple times, and he wants to go on expeditions and tries to arrange them. But when you actually look at what he did, is he had the 5 years in South America and then a year in Russia, and that's it, right? He had 2 trips in his entire life, and he just, I mean, you have this idea of, the subtitle here is The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, but there was basically, well, 2, I guess those are 2 adventures, yes. But I think what kind of I almost didn't realize whilst reading this part is just that he basically never went on an adventure. He was constantly wanted to, but never could.
Absolutely, exactly. And I think what kind of stands out to me about that is it was sort of like what we were talking about earlier, is what drives him to have this strong desire to be on the road, to be out there, to go on these expeditions. And part of it is certainly that there's something out there to find, but part of it is just this, like, he just felt uncomfortable at home. He didn't want to be there. And there was something about even though he was living this lavish, incredible lifestyle, the life of the party and going in these circles and, lots of stuff, you'd look and be like, oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty solid, as far as lives go, I could imagine a lot worse. And yet there was this constant sense of like, man, like I just need to get out of here and get back out there onto the road and that sort of stuff. That was clearly this huge motivating thing that was always present in him, was this sense of this desire to be somewhere else, to keep going, to get back out there, to be on the move.
Yeah. And I guess it must have been, I mean, part of me wonders though, like how much he really wanted that though, and how much he just said he wanted it, because I mean, it's difficult for me to tell to what extent he really tried to go on expeditions, because I mean, of course, in this book, Wulf mentions, how he constantly, was going in circles with the East India Company and these kind of things. And of course, it was difficult politically if basically all the countries were at war with each other all the time. I guess that makes it a bit difficult to actually cross borders. But I also wonder, like, a guy with that standing, like I feel like he could have done some sort of expedition if he really wanted to. I don't know, like go to the North Pole via Norway or something. I don't know. Like, it seemed to me like someone of his standing and his fame, and maybe not his money anymore, but with all of that, it seems to me he could have maybe done another expedition within the 30 years between the 2 that he did in his life. So I wonder sometimes, like, to what extent he actually really, really wanted to go on adventures, and in what case it was. Yeah, I don't know. But do you know what I'm trying to get at?
I know exactly what you're trying to get at. I think I'm pretty sympathetic to his plight there. So there's a couple things that stand out to me about that. One is that, and of course this goes without saying to some level, but it was a time truly before mass tourism, which is really a concept that begins to exist in the 1950s as we understand it now. That's when essentially we see this exponential upturn in what we consider tourism today. And so I think there's definitely, it's an important point to make, which is that that concept is like, oh, I'm just going to go somewhere outside of Europe, particularly, wasn't really the same. Sure, there is basically, like, there is this thing in Russia, I think probably around this time, called the Grand Tour, which was, going to Paris, Berlin, etc., and whatever. So people did travel within Europe, that sort of stuff. But I don't think that the same notion of just, oh, I'm just going to head out somewhere and do something. So that's one thing. But I think what it is that, like, before you've done anything significant, and for Humboldt, this was, in his 20s or whatever, you're not beholden to anyone. It's easy to go out there and do something big and to have this opportunity where it's like, well, I'm gonna do this. But then when you come back and now everyone from the King of Prussia on down wants something from you and expects something from you, and you're now embedded in, this web of expectation and responsibility and that sort of stuff. In a sense, we just call that adulthood usually. But in Humboldt's case, it was even more dramatic because he was so, like, literally the king wanted shit from him and everything. And then also the fame and, people wanted to hear from him, wanted him to show up at their parties and that sort of stuff. And so I just think that, I don't think he was just saying it. I think he truly wanted to go out there. And I think he, in a sense, truly tried in the way that any of us are likely to try once we get to that point in our lives. And that it's just that stricture of having responsibility and being an adult, and especially one that's successful and having people ask a lot from them. I think once you get to that point in life, it's really difficult to transcend that, even if you have all the resources in the world. And sometimes even because you have all the resources in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, to some extent also then he had the responsibility of sharing the stuff that he found out in South America, right? I mean, like in the chapter 9, it says he brought back some 60,000 plant specimens, 6,000 of which were, wait, is that a sentence? 6,000 species of which, oh yeah, sorry. Wait, sorry. Can you can you pass the sentence? He brought back some 60,000 plant specimens, 6,000 species of which almost 2,000 were new to European botanists.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's the 2,000 of the 6,000 he brought back were new to European botanists.
Yeah, but he brought down 60,000, it says just before that.
Those are specimens, not necessarily different species. So there's multiple specimens.
That was
of the same
retarded.
species.
Yeah, sorry, you're right. I confused specimen with species, yes. Yeah, anyway, thousands of specimens and species.
Etymologically, I think you're I can see where the
confusion came from. Yeah. Anyway, but it's more like, if you're the person who collected them, or with your team, and you know where stuff is from, and you have your personal experiences, that just this very, not in a negative way, unspecific knowledge about the place that's then linked to where you took these species from, or specimens from. I guess you do have a responsibility to share with the best botanists and whatever in Europe your knowledge, not to just go off again. Yeah. Because in some sense then it's a nice personal adventure, but it becomes less scientific if you just then leave again and don't do anything with that knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's dive into that. And just to put a pin in the sort of Berlin discussion, there were a couple things that I thought, to sort of summarize what I think about his relationship to Berlin was that I don't think he hated Berlin, though he did claim to, so much as he hated what it represented, which was not being on the road. And so I think it's that kind of is what I think, my interpretation based off of what Wulf is saying, that's kind of how it occurred to me that he felt about the whole thing. Also, there was this line she quoted from him, which I suspect may be the greatest ever description of Berlin, which is that it is, quote, a dancing carnivalesque necropolis, which I feel like is just the most perfect thing I've ever heard anyone say about Berlin. And I don't think it's...
lots of people read that and go, yeah, sounds good.
Exactly. I think that's Humboldt probably meant it as a negative thing, but I think people who love Berlin are like, yes, that's exactly what I love about it. That is the dancing carnivalesque necropolis. That's my favorite city.
I mean, to be fair, I have no idea what the Berlin of 200 years ago, how that relates to the Berlin of today, because I think, if I remember correctly, at some point it said that the Humboldt University that his brother founded, I think was the first university there, right? I think that was in part what he hated about it, is that there was just no higher education, basically.
That's certainly what he said about it, was basically that it was illiterate, I think was one of the words he used to describe it.
Yeah, so I wonder, like, to some extent, just how it relates. And, for example, Tegel, which she always writes about as separate places, which I guess they were then, and now you have, that's where the airport of Berlin is, right? So Berlin has expanded, and, also, like, when they went to Potsdam to Sanssouci, it sounded like this massive trip today. It's like a half an hour by train or something. So yeah, I have no idea how it relates, but I wonder whether to some extent it actually was the way he described it. It was just, not a place of competitive.
I think it probably wasn't as bad as he was describing. I think he was just being a bitch about it. Anyway, so he came back. There were, let's say, like maybe 3 major books that resulted from his trip. Views of Nature was this one that basically gave the scientific overview, kind of like the scientific theoretical abstract account. There was the personal narrative, which was the travelogue. This is the on the ground, here's what I saw and everything. And then there was I don't have the name in front of me, but the essays on geography and plants.
I think that is the title, yeah.
And that one is more specifically about the specific things, his findings about plants. And
there was Cosmos, right?
Well, so Cosmos is 30 years later. I wouldn't say that. I
have to admit, I'm always slightly confused by the chronology in this book, because she jumps around quite a bit. So I'm never entirely sure when which book was written. I always thought it was a kind of fairly continuous stream of books.
I mean, the way so I also don't have the exact chronology in mind. It wasn't clear to me exactly like here's the thing, but it did seem like here was a cluster of 3 books that sort of addressed 3 different ways of parsing Humboldt's initial trip. And then Cosmos was his magnum opus, saying, look, because he needed Russia for that one, because as we'll talk about with the section, he needed that comparative sort of thing. And so maybe it's not necessarily to spell out exactly what was in each of these books, but especially views of nature and personal narrative. Basically what he was doing that was tremendously unique, and I found this super interesting, super fascinating, super compelling, was that he evidently was the first person to really combine, from Andrea Wulf, quote, lively prose and rich landscape descriptions with scientific observations in a blueprint for much of nature writing today. And this concept that it's not just, oh, here's, some detailed description of it. Here's something that's actually supposed to immerse you in the experience, what it was going to be like, which happened evidently in both those books. And then connecting that to the ideas to say, here's what it all means. Here's the scientific interpretation of it. As travel writing, some of the quotes that I have here are, someone said that he wrote with a painter's eye and a poet's feeling. Among travelers, what Wordsworth is among poets. And I thought that was super cool to sort of think of him as an architect of that tradition. And we did talk about this last week. How do we trust the author? How do we trust Wulf when she says, oh, Humboldt was the first to do X? It's like, okay, maybe not, maybe. I do sort of buy this one though. And I found it really cool to think about him being the architect of this tradition. One that I certainly consider myself when I'm writing, that's what I'm trying to do, is how do we connect, some sort of on the ground accounts of what it actually looks like to live and experience life, along with the abstract intellectual ideas of how to make sense of it and how to interpret what one is seeing and feeling.
Can you provide maybe some other examples of books or authors that have done that? Because this is something that I'm just not very familiar with at all. So to me, this is, I think by coincidence, I just haven't read books like that. It sounds like you have.
From an academic perspective, the best description of what this method is comes from an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz. And he was writing this account, at least, these come up with these ideas in the early 1970s. And he's this really epicentral figure in anthropology, where essentially the modern era of anthropology is in many ways a response to the work of Clifford Geertz. And his idea was this notion of what he called thick description. And the idea is that in order to capture the way of living, this is someone's way of living. For him as an anthropologist, what he was trying to do was trying to say, oh, I went here, I saw these people, I engaged meaningfully in their way of life, and I'm coming back to describe what it is that I learned about them specifically and humanity more generally. And in order to do that, what you had to have was this appreciation of both the specific on the ground moments of what happened and what you actually saw and the concrete manifestations of it, and then connect that back to the account. So that's the basic idea in terms of the most direct, my favorite, and what I consider to be the most direct, explicit academic account of what it means to do this. And also, he does a great fucking job of it himself because he's one of the greatest all-time academic writers, Clifford Geertz. So that's definitely one important point, I'd say, from the academic's perspective. And then in terms of just, random people who I think do this well, for example, Oliver Sacks, the neuroscientist, whom you may have heard of in connection with neuroscience, neurology. Or he wasn't a neuroscientist, he was a neurologist. Very much not a neuroscientist, in my opinion. Very much a neurologist. And his thing, what he did, was that he, operating, his early stuff was around that same time of Geertz that I was talking about, in the late 1970s, that sort of thing. And what he did was he took this classical tradition of case studies in neurology, where you actually go through and say, what is the manifestation of this neurological pathology in the person's life as they actually live it? And so he would go through and say, look, this is how this unfolds. This is the human impact of what is happening, and then connect that back to the medical literature on what was known about the disease and what was happening in the brain, and breaking it down from a more philosophical perspective of like, okay, so here is this person's, for example, memory, some sort of amnesia or something like that. Or he studied a lot with Parkinsonians and Parkinsonism and that sort of stuff. So, okay, here's this thing. Here's what it looks like in actuality. And then what do we know about what's happening in the brain? And what does it mean to have one's memory fall out from underneath oneself? So that's an example of someone who practiced that and that sort of thing. So it really ranges not just from nature writing, which is, of course, if you look at the other books that Wulf has published, that's clearly her area of expertise, but closer to certainly what I'm more interested in, and a little bit closer to our interest in psychology and cognitive science and everything. Yeah, connecting those lived experiences and the concrete manifestations of life with the abstract intellectual academic theories.
And you agree that Humboldt seems to have been one of the first people to really start that.
Yeah, I going back to our theme of, this is partially an exercise in helping Cody learn about romanticism and figures of that, sort of era, which my intellectual history knowledge does not extend that back that far. But yeah, so the tradition Oliver Sacks would have been working in goes back quite a ways. He was drawing on this Soviet psychologist named Alexander Luria, who published his stuff, I believe, in the 1950s, but the most famous of his book is Mind of a Memnist, which describes basically this dude, this Soviet dude, who never forgot anything. And this is one of if you've ever looked into memory palaces and the method of loci and that sort of stuff, those memory mnemonic techniques and everything. But basically what was happening was there was this guy, and everything he ever saw, he placed along the side of the road by, I can't remember which road it was, but let's say close to his little village or whatever. And he could just go back along that road in his memory palace and retrieve that. And for whatever reason, he was unable not to do this. And basically, Luria explored how he couldn't function because he couldn't forget anything. And so then we learn about the importance of forgetting things through that and everything. And this goes back to the very first neurologists did this. For example, Charcot, who's considered the father of neurology, which would be late 1800s. And then Freud, of course, is the sort of pinnacle of that pre-modern case study thing. That's obviously what he was doing in interpretation of dreams and that sort of thing. Was, here's a case study. Let's talk about it. So anyway, that tradition goes back to around 1851. Not anyway, but the point is that I do buy it that Humboldt did this in an important way.
Yeah, and just as a brief aside, I guess last time we questioned some of the statements she made about Humboldt being the first to do X, Y, or Z, or how influential he really was at times. I was questioning it a bit, but I think in parts 3 and 4, there were quite a lot of direct quotes from people you'd assume know roughly what they're talking about at the time. Who, basically she's summarizing it in earlier chapters. So I think a lot of our slight skepticism might have been slightly misplaced, or not misplaced, but might have been, I think I buy it more now that I've read the other two parts, where lots of people, it seems like he was really admired by huge influential figures at the time from all spectra of life.
I think there's no doubt about it that he was admired and considered to be a lot of these things. Whether or not he actually was is a separate question, as a matter of fact, but I agree with you that does lend a lot of credibility to the claim. Russia.
Talk about Russia? Okay.
That's kind of what I have next on my...
Yeah, I just have a random... I have no order to my comments, so let's talk about Russia next.
So this, as we mentioned, it was his second big trip. Definitely less grand and in a way less ambitious than the South America one. But as part of his motivation was, besides just the general inclination to go somewhere and do something, was it seemed to really be hinging on this idea of the comparative method. That he went to a particular landscape, particularly a mountainous one in South America, and in order to get the level of understanding that he wanted to get out of it, he felt like he needed to go to a similar, comparable landscape in a completely different area, and thereby understand better the sort of to use a word we've been using, interconnectedness of everything, how these two very different landscapes are connected to one another and have similarities and isomorphisms, but then also to understand what was unique about these places and be like, oh, here's a similar landscape, but it doesn't have X, so therefore X actually can be, in order to get those sort of inferences of it, he needed to go somewhere else and do that. So that was really why he wanted to go to somewhere in Central Asia, ideally the Himalayas, India, and that sort of stuff. But as a backup plan, as it actually happened, the sort of steppes of Russia, and then a couple different mountain ranges within the Russian Empire.
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely a much. I mean, it almost feels weird to call it a less ambitious adventure in that sense, because it seems like for the most part he was, the Russian Tsar just wanted to know some more stuff about how they could mine certain minerals or whatever, and then along the way he kind of just did his thing. So it's almost more like he had, just a work trip that was interspersed by 2 or 3 small little expeditions he made that he wasn't supposed to make. I mean, one thing I found really interesting is that he then, this is for him in particular, a very small point, but that he actually predicted where diamonds would be in Russia. And he was the first person, I guess, to show where they would be. That was something where, I don't know, I feel like, I have a much bigger point about this later, but I feel like a lot of his scientific work is very vague in that sense, trying to connect everything with everything, and thereby not, I don't know, it's questionable how much you actually achieve by doing that. But it was really surprising to me to see like, oh, he is capable of making specific predictions that actually turn out, in this case at least, to be correct, and that go against, the mainstream idea. I guess that's the critical part.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was pretty badass. So definitely both Andrea Wulf and Humboldt didn't feel that Russia had the same magic as South America.
Which is, I think, to be expected. That the Russian tundra isn't quite as fun as the jungle. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that is definitely the kind of the introductory passages of how Wolf describes it is, basically the Russian steppes were pretty boring, pretty uniform, not that different from what one might find in Germany or England, and have this like really tremendously undifferentiated landscape, unlike what one would find in South America. So
I feel so sorry for the guy sometimes. It's like, finally an expedition, and then he just basically sees an extended version of what he already knows.
Yeah. There was so we talked about mosquitoes last time, and there was another great passage that I'm sure you also probably stood out to you for that reason. But I'm going to quote this at length because I think it's just such a great description of like the actuality of travel, especially the particular trip that Humboldt was taking. This is from page 207. Quote, "The thermometer climbed from 6 degrees at night to 30 degrees during the day. Humboldt, Celsius, of course. Humboldt and his team were plagued by mosquitoes, just as he and Bonpland had been during their Orinoco expedition some 30 years previously. To protect themselves, they now wore heavy leather masks. These masks had a small opening for the eyes covered with mesh made of horsehair to see through. They protected against the pernicious insects, but also trapped the air. It was unbearably hot. None of this mattered. Humboldt was in a great mood because he was liberated from the controlling hand of the Russian administration. They traveled day and night, sleeping in their jolting carriages. It felt like a, quote, sea voyage on land, Humboldt wrote, as they sailed across the monotonous plains as if on an ocean. They averaged more than 100 miles a day, and sometimes covered almost 200 miles in 24 hours. The Siberian highway was as good as the best roads in Europe. They traveled faster, Humboldt probably noted, than any European express courier." And so that kind of summarizes the day-to-day of what actually they were looking at. It's like they were making a bunch of progress across nothing in particular. Had these ridiculous leather masks on to protect them against the mosquitoes. It doesn't sound like fun.
I don't know. I wonder sometimes what he found so great about these expeditions, but I guess he loved seeing new things or whatever.
That to me is this outstanding question. Like, obviously, when you and I go somewhere, we don't quite we have to don the leather masks and whatever. But still, going anywhere beyond the sort of like simplest tourist destinations is kind of exasperating. for all sorts of reasons, it's just so much more uncomfortable to go out and go somewhere than it is to stay at home, which leaves me with this question that I think we don't ask enough. A question about travel, which is, why would anyone want to do this? Like what is it? Like he could, like, here's two options. You could either be chilling with the King of Prussia, eating lavish meals and entertaining people at court and, go to bed in your own bedroom, or you could go sleep in the jolting carriage across the steppes of Russia, looking at nothing especially spectacular, eating God knows what, and wearing a leather mask to protect yourself from the mosquitoes. Which of those two options are you going to go for?
Or maybe that's why he was such a famous figure, because he was the only person who actually chose the second option.
But I think that's the mystery of it, is that there is, for a lot of us, and especially for any people, like myself, who identify with this inclination to travel, there's something about that does speak to a person. There is something, maybe it's only retrospective, I don't know. But I think there's a little bit of a deep mystery here about why humans have this inclination to go out there and see something and experience something other than what it is they're familiar with. And I think Humboldt definitely was this archetype of that, but I think it's present in all of us in some ways.
But what is it for you? I mean, I have to admit, I'm not someone who really travels much. I always imagine it's a kind of just curiosity for the unknown. Yeah, just curiosity of what's there, and maybe. I mean, again, in Humboldt, I guess it was fairly explicit, this sense of trying to gain new perspectives on things he knew and testing out new ideas. But couldn't that kind of be an implicit curiosity in most people?
I'm not sure that I know what I think about this question yet. To me, it is the mystery of trying to think about this topic at a deeper level. Because you can say, oh yeah, you're just interested in going out there and having new experiences, that sort of stuff. But I don't think that fully explains that there's lots of ways to have new experiences. Why this kind of mode? Why is that such a thing that draws so many people?
I mean, is it so different? Or is it just we give it a specific name? I mean, if I, explore the city I'm new to or whatever because I just moved here, I don't call that travel because I'm in the same place. It's just when it's somewhere else, then we call it travel. Isn't it kind of the same principle?
I think of this as the Walden problem, which may come up when we perhaps next time talk about Henry David Thoreau. But clearly Thoreau thought that, look, you don't have to go to the fucking Russian steppes to go experience something new. Like, the pond a couple towns over will do just fine. So I think it's an outstanding question. I think, to me, at an abstract sense, what it means to travel in this sort of conceptual way is to put yourself in an environment where your habits and your actions are not well suited to that environment. So that is the defining characteristic of being at home somewhere, being comfortable somewhere, being familiar with a place, is that you know which actions are going to lead to rewarding experiences, and you basically have a whole behavioral system for how to navigate that environment relatively successfully. And the defining characteristic of travel is, in my opinion, in my sort of framework for it, that you are putting yourself in a position actively where your habits and your sort of actions that you're used to undertaking are no longer matched to your environment. And so I think it's a question of, okay, you're going, to the next town over, or you're going halfway across the world. It's not a function of how far you go, but the extent to which that mismatch between action and environment is the case.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to be the case with Humboldt, though, right?
I'm not sure that we got
I feel like for him it's something else.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know. I'm working on the overall idea here. So you might be right. I do think there is more going on here, and the motivations for it and the experience of it is complicated. I'm also not sure that we got enough data on his Russian expedition. Yeah, like we know that he went to like some mountain ranges, saw some stuff, predicted about some diamonds, had a tough time with the mosquitoes again and everything like that. But yeah, I'm not sure that I would be comfortable saying that I understand that. I don't think that I've penetrated fully his perspective and his experience and his mind during his travels and everything.
Yeah, I wonder maybe whether she's going to explain more about this in part 5, maybe, or it's just an open question.
I would definitely like an epilogue of sorts, or I don't know if she'll put it as an epilogue or whatever. I definitely hope there's a chapter on like, okay, given that we worked our way through all of the plots of Humboldt's thing, here's what I actually make of his thing beyond just like, oh yeah, he was the first to understand the interconnectedness of nature. I do hope that there is a sort of, after he's dead, here's what I make of his life.
Yeah, I wonder.
Chapter.
I mean, I'm just looking at the chapters of
I don't think she will. What I know
there's an
about
epilogue
Andrea
of 4 pages.
From her writing, I don't think she's going to do that, but I'd like there to be.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll see.
So we've got about 10 minutes left here in this section, and I do want to talk about the Darwin thing. So I don't want to cut short our discussion of Russia. Maybe we can return to the travel stuff next time in our sort of summary remarks and everything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do want to spend some time talking about Darwin. So that was this, along with the Geertz passages, was maybe some of my favorite passages in the book. I like this chapter a lot.
Yeah, I thought it's very cute, Darwin's admiration for Humboldt, and then his subsequent. Oh, I guess I don't know. Do you want to start then? It seems like you have.
I do. Yeah. So I've got a couple notes on this. So basically, Humboldt was this huge influence on Darwin. And a few different points in this, but basically Humboldt's personal narrative, the travelogue specifically, though he read all the other stuff, of course, but it was definitely the personal narrative travelogue, that along with Charles Lyell's Geology was the book that the most impacted Darwin's thinking. And the way I would describe this impact was that essentially Humboldt modeled for Darwin the kind of intellectual that he wanted to be. Darwin found in Humboldt this template, this way of doing things that he wanted to do. And he was like, there was this really strong resonance where he read personal narrative, and my sort of editorializing it was that he looked at that and he said, I could do that. And that is I understand what's happening here, and I feel like I could do this myself. And it turned out he was right. But basically there's this quote directly from Darwin that Wulf gives us, quote, my admiration of his famous personal narrative, part of which I almost know by heart, determined me to travel in distant countries and led me to volunteer as a naturalist in Her Majesty's ship Beagle. And so it started off the whole adventure for Darwin on the Beagle and everything that turned into his later theorizing. And he was so inside the head of Humboldt that he wrote out entire passages of personal narrative just to get Humboldt's voice and his name and under his fingers. And I love that so much. And he basically saw South America through Humboldt's description of it by carrying Humboldt's descriptions around with him on his own travels. I really think that's how he learned to observe, was that he saw a mountain scene, a mountainscape, and encountered it, knew what Humboldt had already said about it because he'd studied that text so deeply, and was able to simultaneously hold his own observations, what he was seeing, and Humboldt's observations together. And that was really this way that he got into his own incisive perspective. And then after returning from his Beagle voyage, he published his own narrative. And Darwin's sister went so far as to say that he had, quote, probably from reading so much of Humboldt, got his phraseology and the kind of flowery French expressions which he used. And so a lot of what we think of, I've never read Darwin's voyage, but I know a lot of scientists who say like, oh yeah, it's this great thing. And I have no doubt that it is. And it's really interesting to know that that was essentially Darwin's replication of what Humboldt had innovated, his own take on how to do that. And coming from that profound understanding and having engaged in the material himself, he was able to do that to almost certainly an even greater effect than Humboldt was. And I thought that was really cool. And in a way, that to me, after everything we've read, is the thing that I feel like was Humboldt's greatest contribution, was that he taught Darwin how to think. He's like, this is how to go into the world and to think critically about what you're seeing. And Humboldt obviously was very good at it, but Darwin used it to this level. Nothing Humboldt said really changed the world in the same way that Darwin did. And Darwin wouldn't have been able to do that, one might think, if he didn't have that template to work from. Amazing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's two related points after this. Is the first is that I think, especially for, Darwin, it seemed like was very confused when he went on this voyage, right? I mean, he'd stopped his medical training, right? And then he was supposed to train to be a minister or whatever. And then he was doing that, but clearly he wasn't interested in it. So I think he was in this like really weird period where he just didn't know what to do with himself. And it seems like he then just read this book and went like, this is it, right? This is what I can do, at least for, the next few years or whatever. So I think it's really interesting that it seemed to get Darwin started on this journey. But what's the second point then is, and that's what I find almost more interesting, is that it seemed that Darwin took it as a starting point, but then somewhat diverged from that. I mean, in one sense, I guess Darwin never seemed to have the personality or the need that Humboldt had to be around all the time to, talk to people all day, to go on trips and all these kind of things. And seemed like to be a much quieter, more introverted person. But what I find interesting scientifically is that, from what I can tell, the big difference is that Humboldt took all these measurements and had all these facts and all these things and wanted to put it kind of all into one thing that kind of explained everything or showed everything. Whereas Darwin took all of this and then formulated one specific principle from it. At least of course he did more than that, but the big difference to me is that Cosmos, Humboldt's opus magnum, is a piece that seems to describe everything in a kind of pop sci kind of way. I don't mean that in a negative way. Whereas Darwin his magnum opus seems to be something where he took all of these things to then articulate one specific thought. And that to me is a huge, you see what I mean? Like they start off in a similar way, but then they diverge quite strongly after that. And that's what I found quite interesting.
Yeah, I definitely, I think that's a very, very astute distinction, is that Humboldt seems to have been more of a collector. And at least in retrospect, what we, sort of think of for these two different figures is, of course, we associate Darwin with his idea and natural selection and all that sort of stuff. Though, of course, he did do lots of other things. And Humboldt, we can't really look at and say, oh, yeah, well, he had this sense that, like, everything in nature was connected. But that's not really, like, a theory in the way that he certainly had this literary appreciation for everything. And everything was meaningful to him. I think that's what drove him to be a collector, was that each individual thing was a piece of the puzzle and everything like that. As it was for Darwin, but yeah, you're right. The projects that they were embarked on and what they did with that mass amount of information was very different. And I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, was that there's a sense in which Humboldt, what he did was give raw data to people who would come through and create the actual fundamental ideas. For example, Darwin. Also Charles Lyell, who the connection wasn't drawn in this book, but besides being alluded, she alluded to it. But I think it's suffice to say that like that connection is very important and that sort of thing. But yeah, that seems to be the fundamental thing that Humboldt's left, was this influence on people who actually went on to have some of these world-shaking ideas in the next sort of generation of scientists.
Yeah, definitely. I think I wrote down something similar to something that you just mentioned, which is, there's a famous quote that it seems it's not entirely clear who said it, but all science is either physics or stamp collecting. I think Humboldt was definitely in the stamp collecting business of just taking all the facts, or I guess like Pokemon, he's trying to catch them all. He's really trying to like get everything in there. Whereas, and I think Darwin started off maybe that way, but then came much closer to, trying to articulate specifically theories. And what's also interesting to me is that my supervisor and I have also talked about this, because we had one study which was fairly broad, lots of data, sift through the data, find things, not like in a p-hacking way, but in a exploratory way. And we explicitly, I don't know whether he's read this, but we explicitly talked about, some science is you have a piece of like rainforest or whatever, and you just go into it to see what's there. And then you just say, hey, look, there's this thing, there's this thing, there's this thing. And then you kind of draw some vague connections between them. And the project that we did was a bit like that. And I found that very hard and very unsatisfying. Whereas I think I'm much more towards the area of let's actually think this through. Like we have a few amounts of facts, let's create some theories and then make specific experiments.
Yeah.
And I think Humboldt is maybe the extreme example of this going into the forest. And I mean, that's what he did. And then collecting things. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, there's another thing I was just curious about, which is that, there's this book, we've talked about Bryson before, but we've got his short history of nearly everything, which is his extensive history of science and essentially the processes behind it. I was just curious from a different non-Humboldt invested perspective, whether or not Humboldt was mentioned in this book, which is, we can I would not consider Bryson an authority on any scientific matter. I would say, though, that whatever you have to say about the book, it covers some ground. And it mentions a lot of people who we'd not think of as big names today. So it's not just exclusively dealing with the big names, the Newtons or the Darwins and everything, but there's lots of people in here. And so what I found is that Humboldt was only mentioned twice in the book. None of them were for his findings. They were both of them were for social connection. The first one was for social connection. The one was actually a quote, which I thought was funny, and I don't think has appeared in the Andrea Wulf book. But I'll read from here. I'll just read the full sentence in context. But Alexander von Humboldt, yet another friend, may have had Agassiz at least partly in mind when he observed that there are 3 stages in scientific discovery. First, people deny that it is true, then they deny that it is important. Finally, they credit the wrong person. And I liked that sort of theory of scientific progress, evidently quoted from Humboldt. So
Humboldt said that apparently, or
yeah, that was.
Okay. I looked that up a lot, but I didn't know. Yeah,
I looked up in the references, and it wasn't like Bryson was reading from Humboldt's diary or something like that. It was another book that he was quoting, who was quoting. So we'd have to go back and look at that. Yeah. I mean, it's possible, but I'm just saying more fact checking needs to be done because it is possible that there's I mean, there's still links to be drawn out. Anyway, there's maybe we can save our discussion of Cosmos and Thoreau for tomorrow, or for the next episode. Yeah, we'll just talk about the book every day of this week until we... No, but maybe we can save it for next time because we have fewer chapters to cover.
Yeah, it's much less. It's 70 pages. It's half, roughly, yeah.
But there is one more thing I want to say about travel, which I think you partially covered, but I just want to sort of... there's a couple things that I definitely found really interesting in that. And it goes back to Darwin's voyage. And so basically the context, which, anyone who's heard scientific discussions about Darwin is probably familiar with this, but his father famously was really against him undertaking this voyage, and said it was, quote, a wild scheme and a useless undertaking. And I think that in an important way, this is a totally accurate description. That Darwin's father was right in a really important way. And one of the hallmarks of travel is that it's one of the least goal-directed of behaviors that we engage in the course of modern life. And so from the perspective of what achievement is likely to result from it, the sort of expedition that Darwin went on is marked by disutility. And his father was right about that. And then it was Darwin's uncle who convinced his father to let him go, basically saying, quote, if I saw Charles now absorbed in professional studies, it would not be advisable to interrupt them. But this isn't really the case, and I don't think will be the case with him. And
that's such a great way of saying he's just fucking about all day anyway.
And I I actually really subscribe. I think this is a great heuristic. I think that when one finds oneself unengaged by school or work or whatever one is currently involved with in daily life, that's when it's time to hit the road. That's when you need to, something's not working, you need to shake things up, you need to experience something different to free your mind from, whatever it is that's sort of encumbering at home. And, so Darwin goes on this big expedition with the beagle, as we know, he went around collecting, looking at plants and shit and turtles and whatever. It was also funny to note that he had a certain level of misery on board the beagle, just like we've noted from Humboldt, which is, there were a couple quotes that I loved, thought were hilarious. Quote, I abhor the sea and all ships which sail on it. That's Darwin. And then I also, he says also, quote, I hate every wave of the ocean.
Yeah, exactly.
But so anyway, yeah, he went on a ship to South America, and like I said, was carrying Humboldt's observations with him, which I think was important. But then, when he came back and retrospectively was looking on it, he said, ultimately, he wrote that, quote, the voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career, which of course stands in stark contrast to the evident disutility noted by his father and everything. And I guess to me, the deeper point here is that disutility in prospect leads to the greatest utility sometimes in retrospect. So, from the point of view of like, oh, what goals am I going to accomplish by going out and, having this experience? You have no idea because there are no specific goals that you're trying to do. And yet it has the ability to redefine what one's goals are, what they should be, and the whole frame of reference and in which a person's working. And so by not committing yourself to a specific goal, by engaging in this sort of like apotheosis of non-goal directed behavior, you're able to engage more directly with what actually exists, what's out there, and your perspective on what you believe about it. And I think Darwin's voyage is very much an example of that. And the sort of denouement to this story between Darwin and Humboldt is that Humboldt, having read Darwin's stuff, it took him a while to meet. But Humboldt loved Darwin's book, thought it was awesome, thought he'd done a great job.
That was great.
And that was heartwarming. And then they actually go on to meet on page 242. Let me see if I have that right here. They go on to meet, and basically, as you alluded to at the beginning, Humboldt basically went on these he basically never let anyone talk. He just sort of go on, and apparently it was really interesting, but he just couldn't shut up. And so, quote, Darwin was stunned. Several times he tried to get in a word, but eventually gave up. Humboldt was cheerful enough and paid him, quote, some tremendous compliments, but the old man just talked too much. Humboldt gushed on for 3 hours, chattering away, quote, beyond all reason, Darwin said. This is not how he envisaged their first encounter. After all those years of worshiping Humboldt and of admiring his books, Darwin felt a little deflated. Quote, but my anticipations were probably too high, he later admitted. And I think this goes to show another thing, which is that you shouldn't meet your heroes. They're never as good as they are in the book. Don't meet your heroes.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I guess in this case, it was maybe disappointing, but I think Darwin would still rather have met him than not met him, right?
I felt to be honest, as someone who does a podcast where I talk to my heroes on a regular basis, and who, like Darwin, tends to kind of idolize people, especially people whose works that I like, that sort of stuff. I'll just say that I very much resonated with Darwin's.
Although maybe, I just realized actually this meeting was, of course, much after Humboldt sent Darwin these fantastic letters, right? Saying you have a great career ahead of you. You've done amazing work here. Yeah, just that probably would have been better. But yeah, I was actually going to ask, I guess I can take this out if you don't want to respond to this, but isn't Louis Menand, however you pronounce his name? It seemed like, I listened to your interview with him, that he's one of your heroes. It seemed like you had a good time talking to him, though.
Yeah, so that one's a confusing one, because he is one of my biggest heroes, and he's also great. And there's a couple things on there. None of which I think are intrinsically negative, so I'm fine stating them. But at the end of the day, what Louis Menand is a writer, and so he's just that's his best form. He's never going to be as good in any as he is on the page. And so that's just a fact. I mean, part of it is that he's one of the greatest writers currently working in the English language, in my opinion. But so there's just intrinsically going to be a disconnect, and the same would be true, I imagine, of Humboldt's thing, which you're so connected in this, personal narrative thing, his personal narrative, and then meeting him in person. Of course, like it's just going to be hard to. Yeah, there's just got to be a disconnect there because one of them's so monumentally good. Another thing is that when you are so intimately familiar with someone on the page and in their work, as was basically my relationship with Manan. I actually had met him 1 or 2 times previously, but never in depth as a conversation. You get this really intimate relationship with someone who doesn't necessarily exist, right? Because it's your conception of who they are based off of what they've written and everything like that. And then the other thing is that they don't give a shit about you. Even if they like your work and everything like that, you are still so... they are your hero. And I'm not saying that Louis Manon was, mean or anything. He was very nice. But, I'm not his hero.
You're some guy who interviewed him, yeah.
Humboldt liked Darwin and thought he was going to go on and have a prestigious career and thought he had done a great job with his work. Not his hero still. Doesn't really give that many shits about him in the grand scheme of things. And so, for all these reasons, and like I said, none of those are intrinsically wrong or bad, but those are kinds of dynamics that one is going to encounter when one, comes face to face with someone who you previously have only, partially worshipped on the page.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point that you made that, your heroes or just people you admire them usually for one specific reason or for one thing that they did or whatever. And that thing is basically never being great to talk to in person. Even if they're perfectly fine in person, they won't be as great as the thing that they're known for. So, Absolutely. Yeah, I guess apart from maybe a very few exceptions, no one's going to be able to live up to those expectations.
Yeah.
On that positive note. I guess next time we're going to read the end and have more of a bit of a grander, or not grander, but like a more, we've read everything then about his entire life. We've had an account of his entire life, and then maybe we can. Yeah,
we'll do some overall themes and some. Definitely. Yeah. So let's talk about Cosmos. Let's talk about Thoreau, whatever comes up there, and then the final section as we plan to read in the overall, the overall perspective.
Definitely. I also have a few points about science, which I'd be interested to hear your opinion about, but
awesome.
That's next time.
Looking forward to hearing them.
Cool.